Hi, I'm Jim Knotts, President and CEO of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Welcome to today's virtual reading of the names. 2022 marks the 40th anniversary of the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. As part of our commemoration, we'll host an in-person reading of the names at the wall from November 7th through 10th, 2022, when all 58,281 names on the wall will be read aloud. In the lead up to that event, we'll be reading names each day online while sharing the photos of these heroes. For our daily virtual reading, the names of the service members will be read by month and day of death between the years 1956 and 1975 in alphabetical order for the given day. We apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. Know that our readers are doing their best to honor these service members. We hope you'll listen and watch each day and share with others as we remember and honor those who gave their lives during the Vietnam War.
Robert James Anderson, Daniel Michael Arizmendez, Alden McKay Ashman Jr., Enoch Andrew Bollinger, John Franklin Barry, Matthew John Barrow, Robert Henry Beeson Jr., Victor D. Bermia, Lawrence Anthony Beerbaum, John Michael Biondi, Kenneth Neal Blair, Thomas George Blair Jr., John Wesley Blanding, Ananias Boyd, Ernest Boyd Jr., David Bruce Brandon Jr., Gary Anthony Breck, Gordon Michael Briggs, Johnny Lee Brigman, James Walter Briles, Thomas Wesley Britton Jr., James Henry Brutt, Margie Brogdon, Robert Maurice Brown, Aran Cortland Brown, Charles William Brown Jr., Philip Sherwood Bryant, Fernando Camarello Jr., Thomas David Campbell, Lawrence Curtis Kaplan, Charlie Alfred Carden, Rudy Evan Carnley, George Joseph Carr, James Ernest Casal, Edwin James Casaletto, Clement Sam Castaldo, David Orrin Cedarstrom, Charles Edward Cherry, Andrew James Shakontek, Alan Bradley Cipriani, Henry Robert Clausen, James Wilfred Clay, Francis Craig Cleaver, Sheldon Robert Cohen, Marvin Eugene Cole, Randall Vincent Cook, Robert Arnold Corkill, Charles Hugh Crawford, Richard Eyre Crow, Ronald Charles Daly, Terrence Joseph Daly, Donald Everett Dalton, Curtis Ray Daniels, Stephen George Davies, John Allenson Dixon, William Alfred Dixon Jr., Stephen Scott Donahue, Daryl Jean Dorman, Michael Lee Dotson, Thomas Francis Drew, James Cletus Dye, Russ Eugene Eckert, Juan Angel Elias, Gregory Allen Irvin,
Donald Jerry Evans, William Hoke Farmer Jr., Billy Farrell, Johnny Patton Fichter, Milton Eugene Flowers, Will Lee Dennis Fowler, John Henry Garner, Ivan Webster Gatlin, Kenneth Lee Gill, Richard Earl Githens, Dennis Ray Glenn, Aramis Gonzalez Perez, Jean Tyndall Grant, Harold Dexter Griffin, Raul Campos Gutierrez, Frank Earl Hardy, Danny Lee Hawkins, Bruce Robert Hayes, Rogers Lamander Haywood, James Robert Heath, Bradford John F. Hippie, Chris Holliday, Lyle D. Holloway, Billy Joe Holt, Michael Lee Horn, Robert Randall Huff, Gary Arza Husted, Kenneth Marvin Eiler, Gary Lynn James, Reginald Rockefeller Jenkins, James Clarence Jewell Jr., Obie Johnson, Jerry Reed Johnson, John Martin Johnson, William Charles Johnson, David William Johnston, Matthew L. Jolivet, Herman Leroy Judy Jr., Jesse Philip Kent, Michael Terry Latham, Gary Willard Layton, Louis Zapata Leja, Joseph Patrick Logan Jr., Wilbur Ray Lucas, Richmond Ross Luce, Ronald Lee Mabe, Tristal Macias, Neil Kirk McIver, James Jesse McKenna, Bruce K. Manning, R.B. Marchbanks Jr., John Marquez, Noel Don Marr, Emerson Martin, Clifford B. Martin Jr., Harold Mason Jr., Donald McConico, Carl Thomas McCoy Jr., Billy Cesar McFalls, Thomas Theodore McLarnon, Charles Eugene McMillian, Terry Vernon Miller, Ricardo Leon Moreno, Ronald Edward Morgan,
Larry Kane Morrow, William Joshua Moses, James Ray Mullins, Roy Linwood Murphy, Robert Leslie Myers, Nicholas Anthony Natalie, Joaquin Neres Aponte, Jerry Lynn Noland, Van Allen Norris, Michael L. Otto, Donald Stephen Palmore, Arthur M. Parker III, Billy Ray Patrick, Richard Lee Patterson, Ernest George Paul, Gary Michael Paul, Leonard Earl Peacock, Ronald W. Penn, Frederick Joseph Perkins, Robert Kent Perry, John Dennis Peters, Charles C. Ford, Jr., Wallace Edward Pilson, Gerald Wayne Poston, Willard Sherwin Prescott, James Leslie Pridemore, Roland Andre Provençal, Robert William Prize, Wilton Stroud Pyle, Ronald Rauch, Frederick Franklin Ray, Dale Rising, Gilbert Reyes, Roy James Richard, Glenn Dale Rickert, Raymond L. Robertson, Jr., Rodney Allen Rodham, Joe Rodriguez, Roger Espinoza Rodriguez, Mark Charles Rokowski, Robert James Rosenow, Richard Ralph Roundtree, Michael Gene Rushing, James A. Russell III, Walter Jr. Sally, Clayton Edward Savoy, Frank Mark Scarpula, Jr., Ronald Eugene Seguin, Edward Cicero Sexton, Michael Owen Shelley, William Gregory Silva, Victor Simon, Lee Eldon Sinclair, William Edward Smith, James Alfred Smith, Gary Lynn Spiker, Gerald Douglas Spradlin, Walter Bruce Stevens, James Herbert Stewart, Jr., Chatwin Arnold Strother, Joseph Edward Sweeney, Sylvester Swineford, Jr., John L. Thompson, Jr., Armand Rene Thavenel, Jeffrey Gordon Tyne, Earl Kenneth Tynes, Michael Corey Bolheim, Charles Edward Walker, Ralph Bamford Walker II, Daniel Joseph Wexel, Walter Joseph Wetzel, Kenneth William Wickel, Christopher Williams, James Bernard Williams, Jr., Jimmy Stewart Willoughby, Leonard Andrea Wynne, Craig Edward Yates,